Hey, welcome to Notebook Summaries. Today we are taking on the epic history of one of the most fascinating islands in the world. Seriously, we're talking about a journey from ancient tombs older than the pyramids all the way to a modern economic powerhouse. Let's dig into the sweeping story of Ireland.
All right, so here's our roadmap. We're going to start way back with Ireland's deep prehistoric roots. Then we'll look at the waves of invaders who came and totally reshaped the place. From there, we'll dive into the long, tough struggle under English rule, try to understand the absolute tragedy of the famine, see how the nation was literally born divided, and finally, bring it all home to modern Ireland and the big questions it's facing right now.
Okay, so our story doesn't begin with kings or famous battles. No, we have to go much, much deeper into the past to explore the very foundations of Irish culture thousands of years before anyone was writing any of this down.
I mean, the scale of time here is just incredible. People have been living in Ireland for over 12,000 years. And long before recorded history, you had these Neolithic farmers showing up and building these massive, mind-blowing structures like Newgrange, which are perfectly aligned with the stars. After them came the Bronze Age, and then, a little later, the Iron Age, which brought with it the Celtic-speaking people who would have such a huge influence on the island's culture.
So all of these cultures blended together over time to create what we call Gaelic Ireland. And it's important to know this wasn't one unified kingdom, not at all. It was more like a patchwork of different territories that all shared a similar culture. Now, the real game changer was the arrival of Christianity in the 5th century, because you suddenly had monks who started writing everything down, the old laws, the myths, the literature, basically preserving this ancient oral culture for all of history.
For centuries, Gaelic Ireland was kind of left to its own devices, developing in relative isolation. Well, that was all about to change. Starting around the 8th century, new people started showing up from across the sea, and they weren't just raiders. They were about to kickstart some massive changes.
First up, the Vikings. Yeah, their initial raids were swift and brutal, but pretty soon they started to settle down. They founded Dublin and other towns and actually became part of the fabric of the island. Now, their military power was eventually broken in 1014, but their influence stuck around. Then, about 150 years later, a whole new force arrived, the Normans. And here's the kicker. They were actually invited by an exiled Irish king. Their arrival would set off a chain reaction that was going to change Ireland forever.
You know, these invasions left behind really distinct marks. The Vikings, they were master traders. They plugged Ireland into this huge international network and brought in a silver-based economy. The Normans, on the other hand, they were master builders and organizers. They dotted the landscape with castles to control the land, and crucially, they created a formal political link to the English crown, a link that would come to define the next 800 years of Irish history.
And that right there brings us to the central conflict of our entire story, the long, often brutal, and incredibly complicated effort by England to gain total control over its neighbor.
So in the 1500s, the Tudors decided it was time to finish the job the Normans had started. Henry VIII just went ahead and declared himself King of Ireland. His successors took it a step further with the plantation policy, systematically kicking Irish Catholics off their land and giving it to loyal Protestant settlers. This whole strategy was then brutally enforced by Oliver Cromwell in the mid-1600s, creating these deep, bitter divisions that would last for centuries. The result of all this was the creation of a brand new ruling class, the Protestant ascendancy. And this small minority came to dominate literally every single aspect of Irish life. This wasn't just about religion, you know. It was a system designed for total economic and political control. To lock it all down, they brought in a series of harsh penal laws that stripped Catholics of their most basic rights. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't even own a horse worth more than £5.
Okay, as we head into the 19th century, all the pressure that's been building for hundreds of years is just about to explode. This whole era is going to be defined by a horrific national tragedy, a political union with Britain, and a relentless, growing cry for independence.
The story of 19th century Ireland is completely dominated by this one awful question. You see, the country's poor had become overwhelmingly dependent on a single food source, the potato. So when a mysterious blight hit the crop in 1845, the result was just unimaginable.
The result was the Great Famine. Over 1 million people died. Just take a moment and let that number actually sink in. 1 million men, women, and children gone, dead from starvation and the diseases that came with it. And the most bitter irony of all? This was happening while Ireland was still exporting other food out of the country, mainly to Britain.
The legacy of the famine was absolutely catastrophic and permanent. The population just collapsed from death and from a massive wave of emigration. The social fabric was torn to shreds, and it contributed to the near death of the native Irish language. And critically, it filled the survivors with this burning resentment against the British government, who they felt had just abandoned them. This poured fuel on the fire of the independence movement. Now, the political backdrop to this whole tragedy was the Act of Union from 1801. It had gotten rid of Ireland's own parliament, tying it directly to London. So for the whole century, Irish leaders fought back. First you had Daniel O'Connell fighting for Catholic rights, and later, figures like Charles Stewart Parnell campaigned tirelessly for something called Home Rule, which was basically the fight to get an Irish parliament back to manage their own affairs. So as we enter the 20th century, that fight for Home Rule was finally on the verge of success. But achieving it would expose a deep, bitter division within the island itself, one that would set the stage for conflict and ultimately partition.
And this was the fundamental split. On one side, you had the Irish nationalists. They were mostly Catholic, and they wanted an Ireland governed by the Irish, for the Irish. On the other side, you had the British Unionists. They were mostly Protestant and heavily concentrated in the industrial Northeast. Their biggest fear was being a minority in a Catholic-run country, and they were fiercely loyal to the UK.
This division just exploded into violence. There was a rebellion in 1916, the Easter Rising, which was crushed, but the execution of its leaders completely turned public opinion. That led to a full-blown war of independence, which resulted in the 1922 treaty. This treaty created the Irish Free State in the south, but allowed 6 northern counties to stay in the UK. And that partition would lead to decades of conflict in Northern Ireland, a period known as the Troubles, which only really came to an end with the Good Friday Agreement in 1998.
And that brings our story into the modern era. So, while Northern Ireland was grappling with decades of conflict, the independent Irish state was on its own journey of transformation, facing a whole new set of challenges and opportunities.
So the Irish Free State officially became a full republic in 1949. A huge moment was joining Europe in 1973, which helped modernize the economy and led to that massive economic boom in the 90s, the Celtic Tiger. But at the same time, the country was going through this huge social change. The immense power the Catholic Church once held just faded, and Ireland became a much more liberal and secular nation.
You know, Ireland's national hopes are really captured perfectly in its flag. The tricolor isn't just a symbol of the country, it's a powerful statement of hope. The green represents the Gaelic Catholic tradition. The orange represents the Protestant Unionist tradition. And that white in the middle, that signifies the hope for a lasting peace between them.
There's this incredible quote from way back in 1848 by Thomas Francis Meagher, who was one of the first to promote the flag, and he just perfectly captures that vision. It's a dream of unity that's been at the very heart of the Irish story for centuries. A dream that's been hard-fought and is still, in so many ways, a work in progress.
And this brings us to the final, critical question for Ireland today. Because of Brexit, for the first time in a century, the border on the island of Ireland is also an external border of the European Union. So does this new reality create a chance to finally build bridges and heal old wounds? Or does it risk making those old divisions, the ones that have defined so much of this nation's history, even deeper? It's a huge question, and honestly, it remains unanswered. If you found this history compelling, you should definitely check out our Quick Country Histories playlist for more explainers just like this one. And hey, don't forget to subscribe to Notebook Summaries so you don't miss what we break down next.